It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza.
Hello, Irwin. I'm glad to be back with you.
I second that. Glad to be back with you as well, even
if our subject matter of the day is a tad challenging at times.
Doing Our Hamptons can really be a series of peaks and valleys.
Yeah.
Some of these stories are fun and a little lighter, and then you get one like this. And Esperanza and I were lamenting this in the couple of minutes we spend before we press record. And essentially, we're going to talk about, and this is a story that goes back a ways, not that far back, but goes back really started in the late 1990s, but it really stems from a Vanity Fair article that I remember distinctly reading in 2011 when it came out. Mm-hmm. And you do too, Esperanza?
I didn't read it then. I actually became more aware of this, sort of more having a clear picture of it in the last year.
Okay.
Yeah.
The long and the short of it is, it's really the story of two families, and really, it's almost like has become a saga. It's the story of the Whites, we're in Sagaponack now. An old farm. When I say an old farming family, Esperanza, this family has been in Sagaponack farming this land since 1695. So we're talking 300. Wow, do I have a serious voice on or what? This is some like
it doesn't invite levity, this subject.
It really doesn't. You're right. It doesn't invite levity, and I'm not going to say I'm trying to lighten the mood. It's not that I'm trying to do that, but it's just this topic is really, it is heavy. And I don't want people to say, oh my God, I don't know if I could deal with this now. But anyway, it is the saga of the White family who owned a farm in Sagaponack for many years. And
when we say many years, we're talking
over 300 years,
right? Like 13 generations or so, at least
something like that. And one of the oldest, if not the oldest, family in Sagaponack. And it's also the story of the Petrillos, who were one of the tenants starting from 1995. Mr. and Mrs. Petrillo. They live in Texas, or lived in Texas. I don't know where they are now, but they rented, and Esperanza can speak to this directly. She's actually seen them. There were little shingled cottages tucked against the dune right on the ocean, near the White Farm, sort of that area on where Sagmain curves into the beach, and 650 square feet. Tell us your recollections. You've seen this property, we're completely aware of it. What were these like? This was housing for the farm workers, right, Esperanza?
Yes, that is my understanding. They're cottages that, as we've discussed on Our Hamptons, out here we call them camps, and they really are, and they retain that character of just being a very simple structure that is utilized to enjoy really the outdoors more than anything else, because they're very small. The one that the Petrillos, I understand, the one that they rented beginning in 1995 was a 650 square foot one that was called the Model, because the Whites had brought it over from 27 from Montauk Highway, where it had served as a model home in like the 60s, something like that. So again, I love those kinds of stories of repurposing structures. So right. That in and of itself is a really nice part of the history. But yeah, they're all that they're on that size really, they're very small structures and just charming, really charming. And when you say tucked up against the dune, they really are tucked up right against the dune.
Now, do these, I mean, I don't know, do any of these still exist to the best of your knowledge, or as far as you know, they're all gone at this point?
No, they're there. As far as I know, if where I was is the correct place, which I think it was, there are, I think, like 5 or 6 of them.
Yeah, and what happened was, and this is, I think, how this couple, the Petrillos, found this. He was best friend, a man named Mike Burrows. And again, we're getting a lot. We're culling most of this information from the Vanity Fair article of incredibly 11 years ago, 2011. And these were both lawyers at a prominent Manhattan law firm. And Mr. Burrows rented one of these cottages since the 70s. So he was there for 20 plus years longer than before Mr. Petrillo got there. And again, to get into this whole sense of time and place and everything. Now, remember, we're talking when he was there in the 70s, and this is a recurring theme on Our Hamptons. We talk about, yes, Southampton, East Hampton villages, the bookends. Even in this article, it referred to Southampton was the old money, East Hampton was the new money.
Oh, that's funny. I've always heard the opposite.
Yeah, exactly. So we're not, that's in a Vanity Fair quote, not in Our Hamptons quote, but
and really, who cares?
Yes, I would agree. But again, it speaks to the fact that the places in between, Sagaponack, Wainscott, Bridgehampton, they just didn't have the cachet that East Hampton and Southampton did. They were was farm fields, farmland. Right. Yeah. This article even talks about how in the mid-50s, Peter Matheson found Sagaponack, later James Jones, Truman Capote, Kurt Vonnegut, Irwin Shaw, Willie Morris. We spoke about these in a prior episode about Bobby Vans, but how they sort of found, the literary crowd sort of found this. But aside from that, it was really pretty much this was before Sagaponack became the most expensive zip code in the country.
Right. It's just, that's mind-boggling. But one thing that I think bears repeating, which is mentioned in the article, because when it talks about, hardly anyone living there wasn't a farmer, we have to remember this is the famous Bridgehampton loam. Yes. It is, in the article stated, some of the most fertile soil in the world.
Yes.
World.
Exactly correct. And the Whites owned 57 acres on the ocean, and again owned it and farmed it since 1695. We had a prior episode about Ira Rennert's Fairfields, the 63 acres on Daniels Lane, literally walking distance from this property. So again, these things are not it speaks to the disappearing farmland and everything else. But moving on with the story, I mean, John White rented these cottages, for summer rentals, to generate money. Remember, they were farmers. They might have been land rich, if you will, especially in present day, but they were really, and the article even refers to it. If looking at them, you would never know they were sitting on 57 acres. They didn't act. They were volunteer firefighters. They weren't dressed to the nines. They were farmers. These were farm families,
regular members of the community. And we have to remember that he probably, if they were used as tenant housing up until or through the 60s, that was sort of the beginning of the end of the heyday of the potato. And so that would explain why they began, and sort of the rise of the resort community, even for more than it used to be. The 70s was then. So that would explain the renting out to a summer tenant.
And what happened was correct. And the Whites, John White, the patriarch of the family, he made no secret. And this was an issue we've heard so many times over the years about the fear of people and the estate taxes. The land prices were climbing. And again, we're not tax accountants here. We're not going to get into the weeds on this issue, but the long story short, land prices were climbing. And these people had real fears that their children, now he had 4 grown children, they would have to sell the farm just to pay the estate taxes upon his death. So these kind of things were always in mind. And a lot of this also, Esperanza, coincided with a time when this was going on, when the Petrillos got there in the 90s. The pricing, while it certainly wasn't inexpensive at the time, it was sort of stable. It wasn't the insane escalation that was to come post 2000. So
right.
I remember this from my own, having bought my own home here in 1989. For 10 years, if I would have sold it, I wouldn't have gotten a dime more than I paid. It was really post 2000 that things started to change. But moving this story along, and again, talking about Sagaponack, we spoke about the writers and everything. After the turn of the century, Wall Street started finding it and became the bankers. We mentioned how that term on Goldman Pond came to be.
Right. Typical, the artists gentrify a place and then get booted out of it, basically by the wealthy, the uber wealthy.
Yes, that's unfortunately
that even happens in the country, right? It's not just an urban.
Apparently, it's right.
Issue.
And you go into Manhattan, the Soho and Tribeca,
exactly.
And all of that. It's not new. But anyway, this was, and it tells the story how the Petrillos joined what they called a casual fraternity of these white farm cottage dwellers. Now, these were successful people, all of them, but everything there was very low key. They were living in 650 square feet. So it was small. And when word around 1995 got around that the Petrillos bought that southwest corner, everyone in that little, very tight knit, sort of akin to what we spoke of in the episode about 3 Mile Harbor, different era, but they were all really happy about it. This was a little tight knit kind of thing. But anyway.
Yeah. So they worked out a deal, right? The Petrillos with the whites,
right,
to buy a corner of this acreage.
Exactly. Exactly.
And we have to remember that it didn't just imply, he could just buy a corner of this acreage. They had to first subdivide that. There was a whole procedure involved here.
Exactly right, Esperanza. And again, and the article even says now, John White, and this is the words of the writer of Vanity Fair, was no hayseed. Like he was no hayseed. I'll leave it there. I think that says it all. And for years, he weighed plans to subdivide the field. And basically him and Mr. Petrillo, and Mr. Petrillo was a lawyer, Harvard, Yale, very educated guy, but also a Jersey guy, came out of New Jersey, and from a middle-class family, and really pulled himself up by the bootstraps. It's really an American success story, just to give him, to put it out there for what he's accomplished in his own life. Obviously became very successful ultimately, but so Petrillo would commit to buying 11 acres for $2 million. And at the time, a not unreasonable price. The whole field was appraised for $6 million. So he was buying a fifth of it, for $2 million, for $2 million. It's almost above market value.
Right. And think about, they, like you were saying, they had established a rapport with the whites. So it felt like, this was a deal amongst friends in a way.
Exactly right. And Petrillo would have to front the cost for the subdivision, which was not inexpensive. That would have been another cost to the whites. So as of at this point in time, everything seemed to be going along fine. And then the sensitive point was that size of the house that the Petrillos were talking about building. By the way, I have to take a pause and say it's amazing how there really is not much levity in this episode, but we were just, we do try to make this entertaining, but this is really, it's Esperanza. It's hard to make light of this at all. It's just, especially, I think anyone listening can sort of sense the direction this is going to start to go. The whites were very sensitive to the size of the house the Petrillos were going to build. And again, remember, this was already the late 90s. The plans for, I don't know if this was at the time or around the time, but we had Fairfield's, Ira Rennert's house, and there were larger scale houses being built. And basically, that was Mr. White's big concern.
Right. And to not have those, as he called them, monstrosities.
Exactly. And, now as this went along, the Whites would say that Mr. Petrillo gave them repeated assurances his house would be modest in size. He just couldn't put it in writing. Because according to what this article is telling us, it would limit the size of the mortgage that the bank would grant. Now,
and unfortunately, I would just add that it's really unfortunate that at the time, there wasn't sort of as there are usually in these subdivisions, there are covenants and restrictions, as we know, and that they couldn't have included something like that, which of course probably the Petrillos would not have been amenable to including any kind of restriction on the size of the house, although who knows?
Exactly. And, for what it's worth, Mr. Petrillo denied ever saying that. And now the contract said that if the Whites chose, and this was the key, this is probably the key to this entire story. The contract said that if the Whites chose to sell any more acreage, Mr. Petrillo would have the right to match the highest offers they got. Now, John White could pass the property to any of his descendants, but any other plan would trigger that right of first refusal. And after all, to a point you just made, Petrillo was like family now. And if the Whites needed to sell, he should be able to buy it to keep it in the family. Key point number 2, Esperanza, John White had no lawyer advise him on this 1995 memo of sale. He didn't like lawyers as a rule, hated their bills. I'm not going to make any anti-lawyer jokes right now. But
that just sounds like a typical farmer, doesn't it? I mean, I'm sorry, just like salt of the earth person who just like does things on a handshake, which is so honorable. But unfortunately, that honor has gone.
Yeah, I mean, it was, and even the article, the Vanity Fair article says later that would seem to be a grave mistake. And again, it became even clearer when you realize Mr. Petrillo lived in an 18,000 square foot Spanish Mission style house in a beautiful enclave in Houston on 5 acres. So
of course, your second home inevitably has to be, I presume.
Right. And interestingly, Esperanza, on an off-season weekend in 1996, John White flew to Houston to visit the Petrillos. So you could see the relationship here. There was a real relationship between these two families. And the article is saying, really, how could he not come to think that the Petrillos would want this size house?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, my thinking would go to, well, if they stayed at this 650 square foot little model house for several years or, however long a time, and were content there, one would think that they would, when in Rome, you kind of go that way, like, oh, okay, well, they're probably satisfied with something relatively modest that just echoes that feeling of just being right there next to the ocean and done.
Exactly. And look, I'm sure that, again, when you're sometimes, to your point, if you're living in 18,000 square feet and all of a sudden you're living in this gorgeous cottage tucked into a dune, it's like an alternative kind of vibe. And
exactly. It's a little shifting of gears that you might be looking for.
And while they were still renting Mr. and Mrs. Petrillo the model in the summer of 97, the article points out the subdivision process was grinding along slowly, but meanwhile, and here's a key element to bring in, Esperanza, Mr. Petrillo was getting, as the article quotes, seriously rich and wanted to take on a bit of flash. And when he spoke of the house he wanted to build, suddenly the word grander came into play. And so the story is getting told, and Then other things came out in this article, how he had an argument with the builder in his house in Houston, which he was renovating. And this was a high-end builder in Houston who built houses for former President George H.W. Bush, Michael Dell of Dell Computers. And, this builder just said, talking about Mr. Petrillo, he's mean, self-centered. And again, these are his words, not ours. And on top of everything, he wants to hurt you. And this is the part of the article when I remember me reading it 11 years ago, I started to get upset, just thinking, because again, I knew where this was going. Now, in response, David Berg, who I guess is one of the lawyers for Mr. Petrillo, said in a formal tone, our review has shown that the Petrillos are honorable people who abide by their commitments. So again, he said, she said, who knows the real story here. But anyway, by the summer of 99, Esperanza, the Whites understood that the Petrillos wanted to build a big house. And at this point, John White was asking him about it. Petrillo replied the house would be 14 to 16,000 square feet, very remote that the house would exceed 20,000 square feet. Remember, on the corner of the property where 650 square feet was.
Well, and I think, to that point, I believe, and I think that was probably the code even back at this point, maybe I'm wrong, I don't think you can build anything more than 20,000 square feet in Southampton.
Yeah.
And Sagaponack was still part of Southampton.
Exactly. That's correct. This, to Esperanza's point, this is before the incorporation of Sagaponack. So that is definitely the case. But at this point, the Whites were sort of afraid, in a sense. They didn't want to provoke Mr. Petrillo. And Mike Burrows, now remember, Mike Burrows,
who was the friend, the original friend, right?
The best friend.
Brought them out.
The co-worker, the guy who's on this property since the 70s. Now, this is a quote from Mike Burrows, and he said this in a court deposition. Tony had changed. He became very aggressive, and it became clear to me he was not going to do what he promised. And now this is coming from his best friend, the guy who brought him here. And now, Burrows did admit that Petrillo, there was cause to be irked, in a sense, from Mr. Petrillo. The subdivision was not finished. And at the Whites' request, he had sent them 3 down payments of $635,000. Yet his piece of the land was still out of reach.
Right. But a subdivision is not, the process of a subdivision is not the Whites' fault. So. Correct.
It was not. That's also true. But again, apparently the Whites asked him for more money. Now, Marilee Foster, now this is another Sagaponack farming family, mentions how the Whites were sitting on that land that was more valuable than anyone's, and then we've spoke about this before, they didn't act like it. They were lower middle class to all appearances, broken down pickup trucks, etc. But this is Marilee talking. Their eye was on something greater than financial reward. And again,
I think they were trying to avoid future issues, really.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, that seems the bottom line for them.
Exactly.
And what happened was greater issues in the present.
That's right. And this is really, we see where this is starting to head. Even Marilee Foster said something to the effect of, I guess a handshake doesn't mean anything anymore.
Like
something
I said, yeah.
You inferred earlier during this podcast. And again, knowing Mr. White, and it says it in this article, how he was a man of few words. He used to sit at the post office with Merrill Hildreth, whose family had owned the Sag store, which was also the post office. And they would sit on the front porch together. And it was pretty quiet because neither of them spoke very much. But, it was that kind of conversation. You could just picture these two old
men of few words
sitting there. Just their way of conversation was no real conversation at all. And they're talking about the reputation of John White. How, just to give you a little background, we spoke a little bit about the Petrillos. He had a reputation of being thrifty to a fault, rather than buy a gravestone for he and his wife. They they used the backside of his parents' stone in that Sagaponack stone.
That's Scottish frugality.
That really is Scottish, and very good. They were Scottish to say that really was Scottish frugality. And, and yet the whites were setting aside for conservation more land in Sagaponack than anyone else. 90 acres and all. And it says selling the land to developers would have made them rich, but they took a fraction of that value to keep the farm, those fields open. And there was a quote here by somebody who said, they're like characters out of Willa Cather. And moving on. Now, the subdivision was approved and filed in mid-2000, and the deal was getting close. And Mr. Petrillo would be getting 9.5 acres in these 3 lots. But again, this is something we touched on. Something dramatic had happened since that long ago porch meeting. The farm was now appraised at $32 million.
Oh, dear.
Okay, so what was that original price? $6 million, was it? And he paid $2 million for the property, and now it was appraised at 32. That's what happened. It just skyrocketed at this point.
Like you said, post 2000, right? Yeah.
Right. And John White wrote to Petrillo now that this $2 million wasn't even going to cover their estate taxes, which, in a sense, is sort of not Mr. Petrillo's problem. I mean, he bought the land when he bought the land, and
deal when he made the deal,
right? And no one knew. If had anyone known this appreciation was going to happen, the whites wouldn't have sold. None of this would have ever happened. It was to his good fortune, the Petrillos, nothing else. But it was now appraised at $32 million. And John White wrote he needs an extra $6 to $8 million for his lots. And Mr. Petrillo declined. And why wouldn't he decline?
Yeah, of course. Now, I don't know. It's a really like a rock and a hard place. Talk about a rock and a hard place. But I don't know.
Again, it's all part and parcel of what makes this story.
I'm getting flustered just talking to you.
If we're getting flustered, I mean, you could imagine the White sons. They probably still aren't sleeping well. And what can you say? Mr. Petrillo's timing was good. Mr. White's wasn't. That's what it really ultimately came down to. And meanwhile, the Whites canceled the first closing in late 2000. They felt Mr. Petrillo lied about the house size. They also said he'd promised, to donate development rights, sell the land back to the Whites at agricultural prices, which would be a buffer for him and a farmland for the Whites. And this too, Mr. Petrillo said, couldn't be put on paper and wasn't on paper.
Yeah, clearly, I mean, the Whites, from what I am, hearing, is they're really conservationists. These are people that are tied to their land in a way that obviously, after so many centuries, you would be. But really, that's the big point. You think of Peconic Land Trust and what they've done throughout here, because this is one of those situations where they were trying to be conservators.
Right. Exactly right. And again, this is the part of the story where, not to be redundant, but it was timing. And meanwhile, at this point, Petrillo said he's going to bury John White under, this is where it starts to get painful. He's going to bury John White under legal bills. Look, this guy is a savvy, was a very savvy, well-educated Wall Street lawyer, New York lawyer. And while John White was certainly not a hayseed, he was probably overmatched here. And,
really, yeah.
And meanwhile, 10 years later, the filings from this litigation could fill a room. So a year ago this month, we're talking about, I guess back in the day when this was going down, they were forced to close on the sale, 9.5 acres to Mr. Petrillo for $2.1 million, less the down payments. They sold development rights to their beachfront land, all except the Petrillo slice, for $14 million to the town of Southampton, which by early 2007 had the money in its preservation fund to swing that kind of deal.
Which it was 14 million. Huh? I mean,
14
that's
million. Right. Now, and again, now the whites.
Unfortunately, that did happen.
Right. That was 2007. And the whites could have gotten twice. And this is to your point that you just made. The whites could have gotten twice that much if they would have sold it off, to mansion builders. But that land will remain open in perpetuity, a lovely view for all, including the Petrillos, who are on the smaller section of that property. And sadly, now again, we're going back, 10 years when this is, or longer, when this was all going down. Most of that 14 million, 2007, so it's 15 years. Most of that $14 million is gone, spent in large part battling with Mr. Petrillo in court. Yeah, Esperanza's just like
we're both shaking our heads.
Yeah, we're shaking our hands. It's so Esperanza, we've probably lost 90% of the listenership here listening to this story.
But it's these are the stories that have to be told. And exactly. Obviously we thank Vanity Fair for having told the story, and there are several other articles about this. But I think it is a story that is not so well known about the White family, and needs to be worth repeating. Because this is happening with them, it also happens in other places.
That's correct. And remember, there's these farming families are so far and few between. That's sort of where we are. So meanwhile, Mr. Petrillo at this point is still filing more legal claims, money, inconvenience that the whites have cost him, delays, all sorts of things like this. He wants the whites also to pay, wanted the whites also to pay his 10 years worth of attorney fees, which came to over $4 million. And remember, again, that $6 million field went up 5 to 6 times in value when this whole thing was going on.
Right. And I just think he's the one that created his attorney fees. So,
yeah. Again, now moving it along here in this incredibly painful story, the 24 acres of beachfront for which the whites sold the development rights to, 95% of that can get put into a family trust for the roughly $3 million that they set on it. And as for the main house, Petrillo notes it was put into an early trust without an ascribed value. So the storyline is Mr. Petrillo acquired a nearly 10-acre parcel of oceanfront land for 1/10 of its current market price at the time. And this is Vanity Fair talking. Is that not enough? That's one of those rhetorical questions. Is that not enough? 10 acres for 1/10 of the current market value at the time. But of course, David Berg said, why should they be allowed to walk away scot-free when they've created all these problems? Again, the he said, she said.
Right.
It was the whites that were creating the problem for the Petrillos. Why should they be able to walk away when they've created all of this trouble? Now, to start quoting some of the local residents here, Esperanza, Tinka Topping. Now, this is another family that the Toppings have been out here forever. Whatever mistakes the whites may have made with this guy, I don't know, says Tinka Topping, who married into a farm family like the whites that goes back to the 1600s. But someone who comes in to grab some beach footage for summer use is a travesty if it interferes with land that belongs to farmers and preserving whatever vestige of the farming community this village still has. It's infuriating to those of us who do care. And maybe a more calm approach by Peter, the late Peter Matheson. It appears Mr. Petrillo made a very good deal on the land exchange, and one has to wonder why he would pursue all these other claims under these circumstances.
Yeah, well, like you just said, when is that not enough? When is enough enough? And I always ask that question.
And I think that's an excellent. See, even on somber, downcast episodes, we get a little bit of an Esperanza Leon segue. So thank you for that, Esperanza. But it is true, and I think Peter Matheson's part, because I think it's almost a good place to start wrapping up. Yes. When is enough enough? there's a sense of place here of what this community once was. He already got what, we called Ira Rennert's 63 acres for $11 million, a deal of the century. This is a tenth of the market value when he paid for it at that time. Honestly, can one just say, you know what? My timing was good. Let's just shake hands and all be friends and let's move on. But apparently, that's not what happened here. Did you hear that sigh?
Yes, I did.
You heard that sigh?
And in all of this, I mean, by 2018, Mr. White is gone, right?
Yes.
So he dies. And where does this leave the White family?
Now, I'm honestly not sure. I was reading, the last thing I read about this was in an East Hampton Star article of 2018 that is saying that they were forced to sell the father's farmhouse, the 3-acre farmhouse on Sag Main Street, because of this. Now, Esperanza, you had mentioned you thought the Whites or some other family is still in Sagaponack, but
so I have found in 2019 that the White family was able to take back the ownership of the homestead. So I know that is an article that I read on 27east.com.
Right.
And but nothing comes easily. So
no. And that asking price, the current asking price for that land, which was now we're in 2018. It's probably, then it was asking via Sotheby's Realty, $9.6 million. For that 2.8 acres, that's 4 years ago. God only knows what it was
for the farmhouse. You mean
for the farmhouse?
Yeah. So so the farmhouse, apparently the Whites were able to take back title on it, but they gave up the 24-acre parcel that includes a swath of and I'm quoting from the article in 27 East. That includes the open farmland and 5 small cottages nestled in the oceanfront dune. So not just that little corner that he originally purchased, which was the whole contention, but then they just end up owning really the whole. Because
now there were development rights swapped. So in other words, Mr. Petrillo now owns the development rights of that portion of the land. In other words,
well, no, there are development rights on the beachfront, but I guess from what I understand here, then the 24-acre parcel, which is farmland,
right,
is what he owns, and those little cottages are on there.
And wow, so I guess they had to sacrifice all that just to retain their family home.
Yes.
Yeah.
It appears to be the case.
That seems to be the case. So and again, now it should be noted that all of these lawsuits, virtually every single one was in favor of the Petrillos. So on paper, legally, they were completely in their bounds. And again, to really close this chapter, it was probably mostly a sense of timing, poor timing on the Whites' part, great timing on the Petrillos' part. And legally, everything he did was above board. But irregardless, and I'm going to leave it here, Esperanza, a very sad story.
It is, even with the close, the final, recovery of the homestead. It's a tragedy.
I think the next episode we're going to maybe talk about circuses that visited the eastern end of Long Island.
Oh no, that might be contentious. Let's not.
or some sort of really feel good kind of moment, because I don't know if I could do another one of these, but I'm glad we did, because this really is a topic that we've discussed sort of here and there in most of our conversations. And I think that this really kind of encapsulates it. Like, it's just like the feature of something so dramatic that happened with a local farming family. And that sense of place that we always talk about was truly sacrificed here. Exactly right. I think that's true. And again, it really is metaphorically, a story it's a story of Eastern Long Island and the changes of Eastern Long Island, not only over the past 25 years, but go back 50 years, go back whatever, just how this area is.
Well, go back 300, 400 years, really, if you go back to the native populations too.
Back to that's frankly. Also true. But I guess the more things, I guess the only constant is change. And Esperanza, on that note, thank you for this dialogue.
Thank you, Irwin. Until next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.